They installed spike strips around my car just because I grew tomatoes in my driveway. But I discovered the one legal loophole the HOA president never saw coming. What would you do if your neighbors tried to imprison you for growing your own food? Comment below where you're watching from. The police officer stared at the metal spike strips surrounding my car in disbelief. And they did this because of vegetables? He asked, scratching his head. Tomatoes, officer. Started with tomatoes, I said, pointing to my driveway planters. Never thought growing food would make me a prisoner in my own home. It all began 3 months ago when I lost my accounting job. The pink slip came on a Tuesday, along with a final paycheck that wouldn't cover next month's mortgage. That night, I stared at the $200 grocery receipt while eating a $7 tomato salad and had an idea. The next day, I drove to Home Depot and bought plastic planters, soil and vegetable seedlings. My driveway got 6 hours of perfect, sunlight daily, wasted space I could use to grow food and save money. Within a week, I had 2 neat rows of containers along both sides of my driveway with tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and herbs. My first harvest saved me $43 compared to store prices. I felt proud watching little green tomatoes grow bigger each day. Some neighbors even stopped to chat, asking for gardening tips. Old Mr. Garcia from next door brought me tomato cages he wasn't using anymore. Then came the camera clicks. Patricia Wilson from across the street stood on her perfectly manicured lawn, taking photos of my driveway garden. Her blonde bob didn't move in the breeze as she snapped picture after picture. Beautiful day, isn't it? I called out with a friendly wave. Patricia's smile was tight. Just documenting some concerns for the community meeting, she replied, turning sharply and walking away in her tennis whites. That evening, an email appeared in my inbox from Richard Thompson, president of Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Attention homeowner at 476 Oakwood Drive. Residential properties must maintain aesthetic standards according to our community guidelines. Your driveway setup violates code. 1513, please remedy within 7 days. I immediately opened our HOA handbook, flipping through all 43 pages twice. Nothing specifically prohibited container gardens anywhere on properties. Section 15.3 only mentioned keeping driveways clear of long-term storage items. These weren't storage items, they were actively growing food. The next morning, I found a handwritten note taped to my mailbox. Gardens belong in backyards, not where everyone has to see them. Concerned neighbor. The handwriting matched Patricia's flowing script from last year's Christmas card. When I took my trash out later, Patricia and Richard stood talking at the corner. Richard pointed toward my house, shaking his head. Patricia nodded eagerly. They both smiled when they saw me looking. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived, citing my agricultural activities as inconsistent with our community's residential character. The letter threatened a $100 daily fine starting next week. My stomach knotted as I calculated my dwindling savings. That night, I researched HOA laws until 2 a.m., learning about reasonable restrictions versus overreach. I printed the county's definition of landscaping, which specifically mentioned container gardening as permitted in residential zones. The next day, I walked the neighborhood taking photos of every rule violation. I could find holiday decorations, still up in April, unapproved lawn ornaments, basketball hoops, all technically against HOA rules but ignored. Only my garden seemed to matter. I drafted a response to Richard, citing county regulations and pointing out selective enforcement. I kept my tone polite but firm. Before sending it, I knocked on Mr. Garcia's door. They're targeting you because Patricia wants to win the neighborhood beautification award next month, he said, inviting me in for coffee. Her view from her front window includes your driveway. She's been complaining about eyesores to anyone who'll listen. But it's just vegetables, I said. I need to save money right now. Mr. Garcia nodded. Richard always sides with Patricia. Her husband plays golf with him every Sunday. He leaned forward. But they've made enemies. The Johnsons moved out last year, after being fined for their daughter's wheelchair ramp being the wrong shade of beige. I sent my response letter with copies of my research attached. 2 days of silence followed. Then early Saturday morning, the doorbell rang. Richard stood there in a polo shirt embroidered with the HOA logo. Patricia right behind him. We've received your response, Richard said, not quite meeting my eyes. The board has decided to schedule a special hearing about your situation. This isn't personal, Patricia added, though her tight smile suggested otherwise. We just care deeply about maintaining our community standards. Property values affect everyone. I noticed Patricia's phone partially hidden behind her purse, recording our conversation. I understand caring about our community, I said calmly. That's why I'm growing healthy food instead of letting my driveway sit empty. Nothing in our bylaws prohibits container gardens. Richard's face reddened. The board interprets the rules, not individual homeowners. The hearing is Tuesday at 7 p.m. As they walked away, I heard Patricia whisper, "I told you they wouldn't cooperate." That afternoon, I found 5 neighbors with notes on their doors about minor violations, all people who had stopped to admire my garden. Someone was sending a message. I stayed up late again researching my rights and discovered something that made me sit up straight. Our county had a little-known Grow Your Own initiative that protected home food production. Could this help me? As I dug deeper into county records, I had no idea just how far Patricia and Richard would go to win this fight. "Did you really think they'd just accept a vegetable garden in our neighborhood?" my sister asked over the phone. I was sending her videos of my destroyed planters. Dirt and young plants scattered across my driveway. "You won't believe what happened," I told her, my voice shaking. "I went to buy groceries for just an hour and came back to this." The security camera I'd installed after finding the note on my mailbox had caught everything. Patricia's son Tyler and 2 other teenagers had ridden their bikes down my driveway, deliberately kicking over 2 large planters of tomatoes and peppers. On the video, you could clearly hear Tyler say, "Mom says these need to go." The boys laughed as soil and broken plants spilled everywhere. I was still cleaning up the mess when a police car pulled up. Officer Davis stepped out, looking uncomfortable. "Someone reported suspicious activity at this address," he said. "A complaint about illegal farming?" I showed him my container garden and explained the situation. He sighed. "HOA disputes are civil matters, but destruction of property is different." He watched my security footage and took notes. "Those kids definitely knocked over your planters on purpose," Officer Davis said. "Would you like to press charges for vandalism?" I hesitated. Escalating things might make everything worse. "Not yet," I said, "but I'd like this documented." After he left, I walked across the street and rang Patricia's doorbell. She answered wearing gardening gloves, though her perfect lawn showed no signs of actual gardening. "I have video of Tyler destroying my plants," I said calmly. "Officer Davis has seen it too." Patricia's face flushed, but her expression remained cold. "Those plants are an eyesore and attracting pests to the neighborhood," she snapped. "The HOA board has already discussed your situation. Destroying property isn't the answer," I replied. "And there are no pests. They're healthy plants in clean containers. This neighborhood had standards before you decided to turn your driveway into a farm," she said. "Your little hobby is affecting all our property values." As I turned to leave, she added, "You should check your mail. The board voted yesterday." Sure enough, when I checked my mailbox, I found a certified letter stating I had 72 hours to remove all agricultural implements from my driveway or face a $100 daily fine. The letter was signed by all 5 board members. The next morning, while watering my remaining plants, I noticed several neighbors standing in their driveways looking upset. Dave from 3 houses down walked over, waving a piece of paper. "Did you get one of these too?" he asked, showing me a violation notice for his basketball hoop, which had been there for 4 years without complaint. "They're targeting anyone who's been friendly with me," I realized aloud. "Thompson's been fining people for years over ridiculous things," Dave said, shaking his head. "My disabled mother couldn't paint her ramp. The approved beige fast enough last year, and he fined her $200. By noon, I'd counted 5 neighbors with sudden violation notices, all for items that had been ignored for months or years. A bird feeder, a decorative gnome, wind chimes, a little free library box. "This is about your garden," said Sophia from next door, her notice citing unapproved landscaping for flowers she'd planted 2 summers ago. "Patricia's been bragging at book club about cleaning up the neighborhood, starting with your farm problem." I invited everyone over that evening. To my surprise, 8 neighbors showed up, each with stories about Richard and Patricia's selective enforcement of rules. "They only care about rules when it benefits them," said James, who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. "Richard built a shed 2 feet larger than allowed, but the board granted him a special exception. And Patricia's koi pond required a variance," added Sophia, "which was approved in record time. We agreed to attend the next HOA meeting together and challenge the board's tactics. Strength in numbers seemed like our best strategy. When everyone left, I researched selective enforcement of HOA rules and documented every inconsistency in our neighborhood with photos and dates. I was building a case. The next morning, a landscaping truck parked in front of my house. 2 men in uniforms approached my door. "HOA sent us to remove unauthorized plantings," the taller one said, handing me a work order signed by Richard. "You don't have permission to touch anything on my property," I replied firmly. "Please leave now." They looked at each other uncertainly. "We were told the homeowner had been notified," the second man said. "I've received notices, but I'm contesting them as selective enforcement," I explained. "If you remove anything without my permission, it's destruction of private property." They eventually left, but an hour later, I Received an email from Richard. Your refusal to comply leaves us no choice but to pursue all available remedies. That afternoon, while working from home, I noticed Patricia leading 3 women on a tour of the neighborhood. When they reached my house, Patricia pointed dramatically at my driveway garden, and the women shook their heads in apparent disgust. That evening, another certified letter arrived. This time, a formal cease and desist threatening legal action if my agricultural activities weren't terminated within 48 hours. I called the county housing authority immediately and spoke with a clerk named Marcus. HOAs have power, but they're not above the law, Marcus explained. I suggest you check if your subdivision has any agricultural heritage protections in its original plan. Agricultural heritage? I asked. Many developments here were built on former farmland, Marcus explained. Some have special clauses protecting residents' rights to grow food, usually in the original covenants. I thanked him and immediately drove to the county records office, reaching it just before closing time. The clerk helped me locate my subdivision's original documents from 1992. Flipping through dusty pages, my heart raced when I found Section 8. In accordance with County Agricultural Heritage Protection Act, homeowners retain the right to cultivate food-producing plants on their property, provided such cultivation does not create hazardous conditions. I took photos of every page with my phone, my hands shaking with excitement. This could change everything. Returning home, I found my newly replanted containers had been doused with something that smelled like bleach. All the plants were wilting and discolored. As I stood there stunned, Patricia drove by slowly, smiling and waving from her car window. I didn't realize then that chemical sabotage was just the beginning of what she had planned. My jaw dropped when I saw what they were doing to my driveway. I was eating breakfast when I heard a strange scraping noise outside. I rushed to the window and couldn't believe my eyes. 2 men in bright, yellow Maple Creek maintenance vests were installing metal strips with sharp spikes along both sides of my driveway. These weren't just any barriers. They were actual spike strips that would shred my tires if I tried to drive over them. "Hey, stop right now!" I yelled, running outside still holding my coffee mug. The workers barely looked up. The older one with a gray beard mumbled, "Just following HOA orders, ma'am. Nothing personal." "Orders for what? To trap me in my own home?" My voice shook as I took out my phone and started recording. The younger worker at least had the decency to look embarrassed. "It's called property demarcation for code violations. We're just doing our job." I immediately called the police, pacing back and forth behind my now imprisoned car. Officer Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, but his response made my stomach sink. "I understand you're upset," he said, flipping through his notepad, "but this appears to be a civil matter between you and your homeowners association. They do have authority to mark property violations, according to your community covenant." "But they've trapped my car!" "I can't leave without destroying my tires." I pointed to the wicked-looking metal teeth gleaming in the morning sun. Officer Martinez frowned. "That does seem excessive. Have you tried contacting your HOA representative directly?" I marched straight to Richard's house, my hands shaking with anger. I never got to his door because Patricia appeared out of nowhere, blocking my path in the middle of the street. Her perfectly highlighted hair didn't move an inch as she held up her phone. "Recording our encounter?" Well, if it isn't Farmer Jones," she said with a smirk. "Those spike strips must be quite inconvenient." "This is illegal!" I shouted, trying to keep my cool but failing. "You can't trap someone on their property!" Patricia's eyes narrowed. "You've been warned repeatedly about your vegetable disaster. The board voted unanimously last night." She waved a folder of papers. "Those unsightly planters violate 3 separate HOA codes and lower all our property values. My sister is a real estate agent, and she says houses on your street are already getting lower offers." "That's ridiculous," I said. "We're in a housing boom, and my planters are neat and well-maintained. Farms belong in the country, not in Maple Creek estates," she snapped. "Remove those plants and we'll remove the barriers. Simple as that." Richard appeared behind her, arms crossed. "We've had complaints from 7 different homeowners. This isn't personal. It's about maintaining standards." As they walked away, I heard Patricia laugh. Maybe she can grow enough to feed herself since she won't be able to drive to the grocery store. I felt trapped and desperate. My doctor's appointment was tomorrow, and I needed to pick up my mom from her physical therapy this afternoon. I called 5 different tire shops, but the spikes were designed to cause maximum damage. No temporary fix would work. That night, instead of crying, I got angry, and then got smart. I drove my riding lawnmower, carefully avoiding the spikes, to my neighbor, Ellie's house, and borrowed her car. Then I headed downtown to the county records office, which stayed open late on Wednesdays. The clerk looked bored as I requested the original subdivision plans and covenants for Maple Creek Estates. Property dispute? She asked, not looking up. You could say that, I replied. 3 hours later, surrounded by dusty documents and property maps. I found it, the single piece of information. The HOA had either overlooked or deliberately hidden. My hands trembled as I made copies, my mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just a way out of my current situation. This could change everything about how our neighborhood was run. I drove home in Ellie's car. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the spike strips that surrounded my driveway. But for the first time all day, I smiled. Richard and Patricia had no idea what was coming their way. They installed what around your driveway? Sarah Jenkins nearly spat out her coffee when I showed her the photos of the spike strips. I'd called her first thing in the morning. She was the best property rights lawyer in the county, and I'd found her number on a community board at the records office. Spike strips. Like the police used to stop criminals, I explained, sliding the manila folder of documents across her desk. They're basically holding me hostage until I remove my vegetable garden. Sarah adjusted her glasses and examined the papers I'd found. After 10 minutes of silent reading, she started laughing. Not a small chuckle, but a full-blown laugh that made her assistant peek in to see what was happening. In 15 years of practicing HOA law, I've never seen a board make such a massive mistake, she said, tapping the oldest document in the pile. Your entire subdivision was built on land designated under the County Agricultural Heritage Protection Act of 1998. It was originally the Henderson family farm, and when they sold it to developers, they included a special covenant. She pointed to a paragraph written in dense legal language. This says all homeowners retain the explicit right to grow food on their property, and that right shall not be infringed by any future homeowners association or governing body. This can't be overridden by HOA bylaws they created later. My heart pounded with hope. So my garden is completely legal? More than legal, it's specially protected, Sarah said, already typing on her computer. And those spike strips? That's unlawful detention, possibly even criminal. We're filing an emergency injunction right now. By noon, the paperwork was submitted to the county court. Sarah suggested I document everything, so I posted a single photo of the spike strips on my neighborhood social media group with a simple caption. Is this how HOAs should solve disputes about vegetable gardens? The post exploded. By 3 o'clock, a reporter from Channel 7 News knocked on my door, followed by 2 more news vans. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from neighbors I'd never even met, sharing their own HOA horror stories. We're live at Maple Creek Estates, where a homeowner claims the HOA installed dangerous spike strips around her car, all because she grew tomatoes in decorative planters. The reporter announced into the camera on my front lawn. I was explaining the situation when a black SUV screeched to a halt across the street. Patricia practically flew out the passenger door, with Richard right behind her, both looking like they'd swallowed lemons. Turn those cameras off, Richard shouted, storming across my lawn. This is a private neighborhood matter. The reporter, sensing drama, signaled her cameraman to keep rolling. Mr. Thompson, as HOA president, did you authorize the installation of these tire puncturing devices? Patricia pushed in front of the microphone. This is completely one-sided. She's violated multiple community standards with that eyesore. She pointed dramatically at my neat row of planter boxes, where cherry tomatoes ripened in the sun. Those eyesores help feed my family, I said calmly, knowing my composed response would contrast with their anger. And nothing in the HOA guidelines prohibits container gardens. The cameras followed as Patricia and Richard retreated, then marched up my walkway once the news crew left for their next appointment. Patricia's perfectly manicured nail jabbed toward my face. You're making us look like monsters on social media, she hissed, her face flushed. You installed spike strips around my car, I reminded her evenly. How would you describe that? Richard stepped forward, lowering his voice to sound reasonable. Look, we can resolve this quietly. Remove your garden, we'll remove the strips, and forget the violations. No lawyers, no media circus. I took a deep breath and pulled out the copies Sarah had prepared. I have a counteroffer, I replied, handing them the agricultural heritage documents. Remove the strips immediately, or I continue with my lawsuit, which now includes false imprisonment, harassment, and violation of protected agricultural rights. Their faces transformed as they read, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally, the dawning realization of their massive mistake. But instead of backing down, Richard's face hardened. He snatched the papers and tore them in half. We'll see what our lawyers say about your little farm loophole. The HOA has a $300,000 legal defense fund, and we're not afraid to use it. Do you have that kind of money? As they stormed off, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Judge Watkins is reviewing our emergency motion right now. Stay strong. I tried to focus on watering my plants that evening, but worry gnawed at me. What if the judge sided with the HOA? What if Richard was right about their legal fund outlasting my savings? At 2:17 a.m., my security camera's alert woke me up. The motion-activated floodlights revealed a figure hunched by my garden. Patricia's husband, Tom, wearing a dark hoodie despite the warm night, garden shears glinting in his hands. On my phone screen, I watched in disbelief as he systematically cut through every irrigation line connecting my self-watering system, then slashed the soil bags I'd stored for next season. I called the police immediately, and this time they took it seriously. Officer Martinez arrived within minutes, catching Tom still on my property. The look of shock on his face when the police car lights flashed was something I'll never forget. Mrs. Walker claims you've been harassing her, and now we find you vandalizing her property at 2 a.m., Officer Martinez said, making notes as Tom stammered excuses. My husband was just checking for, rats around her garden, Patricia insisted, having rushed over in her silk bathrobe. Those vegetable plants attract vermin. Officer Martinez picked up the garden shears. With these, ma'am, we have the whole incident on security video. As Tom was escorted to the police car for questioning, I noticed several neighbors watching from their windows. Dave from down the street gave me a thumbs up. Ellie waved encouragingly. For the first time, I realized I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. My phone chimed with an email from Sarah. Emergency hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. We've got them cornered. As dawn broke over my imprisoned car and damaged garden, I felt strangely calm. The HOA had seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. Tomorrow would change everything. Not just for me, but for our entire community. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Watkins entered, her stern expression giving nothing away. My stomach twisted into knots when I spotted Richard and Patricia sitting confidently with their attorney, a sleek man in an expensive suit who kept whispering in Richard's ear. They had 3 people on their side of the room. I was surprised to see over 20 of my neighbors had shown up to support me, filling the benches behind Sarah and me. Before we begin, Judge Watkins said, adjusting her glasses, I want to make something very clear. I reviewed the evidence until midnight, and I am deeply troubled by what I've seen. Richard's attorney stood up smoothly. Your Honor, if I may? You may not, Judge Watkins cut him off. Mr. Parker, I've read your brief. Now I want to see these spike strips for myself. The courtroom screens lit up with my photos and video. Several people gasped at the images of the metal teeth surrounding my driveway. Mr. Thompson, the judge addressed Richard directly. As HOA president, did you authorize these devices to be installed? Richard stood, straightening his tie. Yes, Your Honor, but they were simply property markers to indicate a violation zone, not meant to. They are designed to puncture tires, Judge Watkins interrupted. The maintenance company's invoice specifically lists them as vehicle deterrent spike systems. Did you or did you not intend to prevent Ms. Walker from using her vehicle? When Richard hesitated, Patricia jumped up. She was breaking the rules. We gave her multiple warnings about that garden. The judge's gavel banged sharply. Mrs. Davis, you are not recognized to speak. Please sit down. Sarah presented the agricultural heritage documents next, explaining how they predated and superseded any HOA regulations. Richard's lawyer argued that modern community standards should take precedence, but his voice faltered when Judge Watkins held up the original covenant. This language is crystal clear, she said. The right to grow food on one's property is explicitly protected. Furthermore, there's nothing in the current HOA guidelines that specifically prohibits container gardening. Then came the security footage from last night. Tom Davis, cutting my irrigation lines at 2:17 a.m. Patricia's face turned crimson as her husband's actions played on the screens. Mr. Davis has already been charged with criminal vandalism, Officer Martinez testified. He admitted Mrs. Davis asked him to do something about the garden situation. After just 40 minutes of arguments, Judge Watkins delivered her ruling. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, she announced. The Maple Creek Estates HOA actions constitute unlawful detainment, harassment, and violation of protected property rights. Her voice hardened. Installing physical barriers, preventing a homeowner from using their vehicle is particularly troubling. This court doesn't look kindly on vigilante enforcement tactics. My eyes filled with tears as she continued. The HOA is ordered to remove the spike strips immediately. Within the hour, they will pay damages of $15,000, reimburse all legal fees, and repair all vandalized garden equipment. She looked directly at Richard. Additionally, I am mandating new HOA board elections within 30 days, supervised by a court-appointed observer. Richard's face went from red to white. Patricia buried her face in her hands. Your Honor, Richard's attorney began, we intend to appeal. That is your right, Judge Watkins nodded. However, the removal order and election requirement will not be stayed during any appeal. And Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Davis, if there is any further harassment of Ms. Walker, this court will not hesitate to find you in contempt. Are we clear?" They nodded silently. As we left the courtroom, Sarah squeezed my arm. "This is a bigger win than you might realize. This case creates a precedent for thousands of homeowners in similar situations." When I turned onto my street that afternoon, I couldn't believe my eyes. A crowd had gathered outside my house, and at first, I feared the worst. Had Patricia organized some kind of protest? But as I got closer, I realized they were my neighbors, cheering and clapping. The maintenance crew was already removing the spike, strips under Officer Martinez's watchful eye. Dave from down the block approached my car window. "We watched the hearing on the court's livestream," he grinned. "You stood up for all of us." He handed me a beautiful ceramic planter painted with sunflowers. "For our neighborhood's defender." Tears filled my eyes again as Ellie and her husband unveiled a handmade sign they'd created. Maple Creek Community Gardens, growing together. They'd collected signatures from over 50 neighbors who wanted to start a shared garden space in the unused land behind the neighborhood playground. "We never knew about that agricultural heritage clause," Ellie explained. "It applies to the whole subdivision, not just your property. We've been wanting community garden space for years." Over the next few weeks, something amazing happened. My little victory rippled outward in ways I never expected. Richard resigned from the HOA board completely and put his house up for sale. The new board, led by Dave and Mrs. Johnson from Maple Street, approved the community garden project unanimously. Even more surprising were the visitors from other neighborhoods. "We heard about what happened here," a woman from Oak Ridge Estates told me as she admired my thriving tomato plants. "Our HOA has been just as bad. Can you tell us how you found that original covenant?" I expanded my own garden, adding a small sign. "Community Harvest. Take what you need." The children from the neighborhood started stopping by after school, curious about how food grows. Mrs. Gonzalez, who had initially signed Patricia's complaint petition, sheepishly asked for gardening tips when her granddaughter became fascinated with my strawberry plants. I was wrong, she admitted, watching her granddaughter carefully water the seedlings I'd given them. Patricia kept saying these plants would bring down our property values, but my daughter's family is now considering moving here because of the community garden. Patricia still lives across the street, but now crosses to the other side when she sees me coming. Tom completed his community service hours by, ironically, helping build raised beds for the new community garden space. He turned out to be quite skilled at carpentry. When not sneaking around cutting irrigation lines, the biggest surprise came 3 months later. I was invited to speak at the County Planning Commission about urban agriculture rights. 3 nearby HOA communities wanted help establishing their own community garden spaces, inspired by our story. "Your case has become something of a legend," the commissioner told me. "People are demanding to know what rights they actually have under these restrictive HOAs." This morning, as I harvested the last tomatoes of the season from my driveway planters, I noticed faint marks still visible on the concrete, where the spike strips had been. I couldn't help but smile. They're a reminder that standing up for what's right can change more than just your own situation. My phone chimed with a text from Sarah. "Guess what? State legislature just introduced the Homeowner Food Freedom Act, and they mentioned your case by name." I looked at my flourishing garden, then at the community garden beyond, where neighbors worked together among rows of vegetables and flowers. Sometimes the most beautiful harvests aren't the ones you can eat, but the connections and changes that grow from standing your ground. And it all started because one small garden made Patricia Davis so angry she couldn't see past her own rulebook long enough to check the actual law. As my grandfather used to say, before you dig up someone else's garden, make sure you know whose land you're standing on.